Hey guys, welcome back to the channel where you can find all of your basic guides on Total War games. Today, CA just revealed the Kislev unit roster, so we're going to take a look at the units they describe and make our own speculations on their roles in the army. Tsarina Katerin will be our first legendary lord. She gets access to the lore of ice, given that she is a complete master of the lore of ice, making her spells deadlier, cheaper, and faster. She would get access to her legendary blade, Frostfang, that comes with its own explosive spell. As for her mounts, she will be able to ride a warhorse or a warbear in her later levels. Supreme Patriarch Kolstalton is our second legendary lord. CA describes an ability called Ursen's Ward, saying that he is an unkillable paragon of his people, and even the most mortal wounds simply power him to greater heights of furiosity. Given that Ward is in the name, I assume that this will be a flat damage reduction that he gains, but with the added effect that as he takes more damage, his fighting capabilities increase in a scaling manner. Man of the People seems to be another type of encourage ability. Perhaps this will be buffing nearby units with leadership and maybe some other melee combat stats. He will more than likely be used for fighting alongside our frontlines. So there are two other Kislev lords, the Boyar and the Ice Witch. The Boyar is described as an extraordinary warrior. We can assume that this will be a melee specialist lord. He will more than likely be used for fighting alongside the front lines. He might even be classified as a duelist lord. The Boyar will also be able to mount a warhorse or a warbear in his later levels. Next is the Ice Witch. She will obviously get access to the lore of ice, which specializes in disrupting enemy movement, freezing them to death, as well as encasing allies in protective barriers or buffing them up with armor-piercing damage. She also gets access to the lore of Tempest, which speeds up allies and sends enemies to a swift death by incredible blizzards and biting cold. Her mounts will also be a warhorse or a warbear. The Ice Witch will more than likely not be a very good melee combatant and will need to be placed behind our front lines. The Frost Maiden is our first hero. She also gets access to the lore of Ice and Tempest, and she gets a warhorse or a warbear. There's not much else said about her. She is just a hero variant of the Ice Witch, so if you don't have the Ice Witch Lord in your army, you can bring the Frost Maiden to supplement. Lastly, we have the Patriarchs. These are sentinels of the Kislevite faith. They exhort the warriors around them to acts of courage, protecting them with the power of faith. They stride into battle bellowing the folk songs of the Kislevite people with the cadence of battle hymns. As described, we can only assume that their spells will be buffing up your units on the battlefield, mainly the combat stats, and possibly leadership buffs as well. The Patriarch will also get access to the Warhorse and the Warbear. Kossars will be the main bulk of the Kislev missile infantry. They have two variants, bow and axe and bow and spear. They are described as cheap and easy to build, so they will be more than likely our low-tier missile infantry. Just as many low-tier missile infantry, they will probably not have great armor-piercing damage, although given that they are described as hardened fighters, these will perform decently well in melee combat if they run out of ammunition or get flanked by enemy units. The Streltsy are going to be our hybrid missile infantry. They have the gun great axe weapon, which is probably the coolest hybrid weapon in Warhammer history. These units are armored, and since they are gun units, they will have armor-piercing damage. Alongside that, they will be good melee combatants as well. Given that they are gunpowder units, will we need to place them on elevated ground or in checkerboard formations so that they fully utilize their firepower. The Ice Guard are the elite warriors of the Ice Court, also known as the bodyguards for the Ice Witches. They are described as fearsome and fearless, which means they could have some immunity to psychology trait and cause fear to enemy units. It does say that their weapons are imbued with ice magic, so we can probably assume that their weapon damage will be magical. There are two variants, the bow and dual sword and the bow and glaive. The bow and dual sword will be more than likely the anti-infantry, and the bow and glaive will be the anti-large. We are seeing a trend with the Kislev roster having missile infantry that can defend themselves. It does say that their weapons do inflict frostbite, slowing the enemies, but it does not specify whether or not the frostbite will be inflicted from melee or ranged damage. The armored Kossars are your melee infantry. They have two variants, pistol and axe with shield, or pistol and great mace. The pistol and axe with shield variant will more than likely be our main early game frontline unit. while the pistols with great maces will be our armor-piercing option for the early game. The Star Guard are higher tier melee infantry. There are two variants, Sword and Shield and Great Sword. These are the most elite fighting force and personal guard of Tsarina Katerin. They are heavily armored, meaning they will be our mid to high tier frontline infantry. The Great Sword variant will be our armor-piercing option. Downside of these is that they are much slower than the rest of the roster, so this definitely means that the Sword and Shield variant will be the main frontline unit. The Kosovite Dervishes are our first cav unit. They will probably be lightly armored given that they have Vanguard deployment and are extremely fast. These will be used for your hit and run tactics, but they are not meant for prolonged combat. We will probably be using these for chasing down the enemy back lines. The Winged Lancers are our next cav unit. These are much slower than the Dervishes, but they pack a punch on the charge, meaning they will be our first shock cav. We'll be using these for our hammer and anvil tactics on the enemy front lines, cycle-charging them to ensure we fully utilize the high charge bonus. The Griffin Legion look like they will be an upgraded version of the Winged Lancers, providing more charge bonus at a higher cost. We will be using them for our hammer and anvil tactics and cycle-charging them as well. The Warbear Riders are our elite cav, obviously riding bears. These will be our cav used to rear charge the enemy front lines. We will be able to leave them in prolonged combat as these will have much better melee combat stats. The Horse Archers are similar to the Dervishes. They are light cav with Vanguard deployment. These will be used for harassing the front line on their approach and then moving them to fire into their backs once they have clashed with our front lines. These are also decent melee combatants, so we can send them into melee once they run out of ammunition. The Light War Sleds are the first chariot unit. These are the faster and lightly armored chariot of the unit roster. More than likely they will have some anti-infantry bonuses, and we'll be using these to mow down the frontline infantry or charging them through isolated units on the battlefield. Just like any other chariot unit, we probably won't be able to leave them in prolonged combat. The Heavy War Sleds are similar to the Light War Sleds, but they will have more armor and be much slower. These will more than likely be used in the same way as the Light War Sleds. The Snow Leopard is our first beast unit. They are described as more than capable of taking down humongous creatures, so we can probably assume that they will have some anti-large bonuses. They are extremely fast so that we can use them to chase down skirmishing missile cav, or we can send them after the monstrous units on the battlefield. The Elemental Warbear has been showcased many times. It's a giant bear. It is described as unbreakable. More than likely it will have some anti-infantry bonuses and be used to basically wreak havoc on the frontline engagements. Lastly, we have Little Grom. Kislev is not known for its artillery, but Little Grom will do. It is a long-range cannon pulled by two bears. We'll probably see some armor-piercing damage on it, and will more than likely be used primarily against infantry and less on monstrous units. It does say that the artillery piece can function as a chariot unit once it runs out of ammunition. So that's it for the Kislev roster reveal. Compared to Warhammer 1 and 2 factions, the Kislev roster does seem quite small, but there is always a possibility of DLC to further expand the Kislev roster. Hope you guys enjoyed this full roster reveal. Make sure to keep an eye out for the next roster reveal as we will be covering them right when they are announced. If you enjoyed this video, drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already.